I played tennis in college, and our tennis courts were situated within an orange grove, which was adjacent to the soccer field that our women's team used each day. During my time at Westmont College, our women's team was dominant, and they made a habit of winning national championships. We had a lot of really talented women, but their success as a team was due in part to the fact that their coach, Mike Giuliano, had a tremendous advantage over other coaches around the country. In addition to his expertise in the X's and O's of soccer, he had a PhD in communications. And given the proximity of our tennis court to the soccer practice field, I got to see him coach up close. Experienced coaches understand how important relationships and communication are to effective leadership. Former Georgetown basketball coach John Thompson is credited with saying, "You can communicate without motivating, but you cannot motivate without communicating." When we think about communication, we must accept certain inalienable truths. First, you cannot not communicate. It's kind of like when your girlfriend asks if you like her new wedges. A blank stare is just another form of communication. And if you don't comment on her hair after she gets back from the salon, believe me, you're still communicating. Second, you can't take it back. People can choose to forgive, but they can't really choose to forget. We don't have as much control over our memory as we do our attitudes. So once it's out there, you really can't take it back. Even if you say, "Oh, but I take it back," or you explain that you were completely wasted when you said it. So be careful. As Warren Buffett says, it takes 20 years to build a reputation, but 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently. Third, less is more. So be succinct and get to the point. When we think about communicating, we need to take the perspective of those we are communicating to. As John Wooden said, you haven't taught until they've learned. And as Red Auerbach, who was the 9-time NBA championship winning coach of the Boston Celtics during the Bill Russell era, it's not what you tell them, it's what they hear. And this is certainly true, but words don't tell the whole story of human communication, because communication is so much more than words. And actually, speech is often the most unreliable and relied upon form of interpersonal communication. And it is nonverbal communication that makes our relationships with loved ones so deep and our lives so rich. And nonverbal communication, by the way, doesn't usually happen over social media. Even video calls are limiting because you can see the person, but you can't make eye contact with them. Anyway, Hollywood and Nashville have always been enamored with love and have mused extensively about the role of nonverbal communication. Consider the first verse and chorus of One Country Song, written by Keith Whitley and made famous by Alison Krauss. When you say nothing at all alludes to the fact that we communicate through facial expressions, we communicate through our posture, we communicate through eye contact, we communicate through touch, we communicate through our physical appearance, but we also communicate through proximity and time. So let's look a little deeper at each form of nonverbal communication. Nonverbal communication is critically important for sport leaders who are sometimes totally unaware that they are communicating nonverbally. Remember, you cannot not communicate. And also remember that less is more. Sometimes you don't even need to say a word to get your point across. To paraphrase this guy, you don't get any better than 0 words. Facial expressions. We have natural facial expressions and artificial or culture-bound facial expressions. Some of our facial expressions are universally human. Just like the Small World ride at Disneyland says, there is just one moon and one golden sun, and a smile means friendship to everyone. And I apologize in advance for getting that song in your head for the next 42 hours. But it's true. No matter what country you visit, people understand smiles. And other facial expressions associated with emotions such as fear or sadness are universally produced and universally recognized as well, regardless of culture. And what is also universal is our ability to mask emotions. That is, to control our facial expressions to obey cultural norms. But the rules and norms for masking emotions are governed by cultures and subcultures. US gymnasts and figure skaters, for instance, end their routines by emphasizing their exuberance to melodramatic levels, which would be gross violations of display rules in some cultures. And consider the subcultures of basketball in the United States. When kids are 7 or 8 years old, they can't help but grin while running down the court after they make a basket. It's natural to be joyful when we succeed in things that are meaningful to us. But if you watch kids who are a little older, say 13 or 14 years old, you don't see the same grin after a basket is made. And this may be due in part to the fact that scoring a basket isn't as novel or unusual at that age. But it also may be due to the fact that teenagers have learned the display rules which govern how we act in certain situations, like playing basketball. For whatever reason, in basketball it is normal to mask happiness in favor of an expression that lets people know that you're not particularly impressed. Maybe as a way of demonstrating that you've been there before, or you're too focused on defense to enjoy the moment, or that you're a really tough guy, or that you had expected to win gold. But when baskets are missed, we also see communication through facial expression at work. When kids miss baskets, they sometimes whip their head around to see how a coach on the bench or a parent in the stands has reacted. I call this the youth sport whiplash syndrome. It's pretty normal for coaches and parents to show some form of disappointment or frustration in their facial expressions. But the best coaches are usually pretty good at masking their emotions and maintaining a neutral expression. During a UCLA game in the 1960s, a commentator quipped, "Ooh, John Wooden just raised an eyebrow. He must be furious." Coaches and parents should be careful with their facial expressions if they want to do what they can to help their kids do their best. Think of it this way. If you miss a shot, it's a bit discouraging. And if you look at a parent or a coach who grimaces in frustration or glares in anger, it's a bit more discouraging. And think about what that word literally means, discourage. Discourage as in to take away courage, or you have less courage. Courage is a good thing to have if you're trying to perform at your best. So instead of a grimace or glare, if a parent or coach gives a reassuring nod in response to a missed basket, they can actually encourage or give back some of the courage that the kid lost when they missed the shot. And this all happens without a single word being spoken. Facial expressions are critically important, and parents and coaches should be intentional about their facial expressions if they want to encourage rather than discourage further. And they need to remember that once it's out there, they can't take it back. Our posture also sends a message to those around us. People tend to get big when they're feeling confident or dominant. People tend to get small when they're feeling fearful or submissive. So posture is a good indicator of an athlete's mental state. Our posture says something about us, and it says something to us. But like breathing, we can change our posture if we're deliberate about doing so. And if we do, we can change our mindset. If you want to feel confident, get big, take up space, just like a goalkeeper before a penalty shot. Fake it until you make it. Next, eye contact. This is one where we really connect as humans. And eye contact is something that varies dramatically by culture, even within the United States. Growing up in Seattle, I learned a set of unwritten and unspoken rules about when to make eye contact. Communication theorists call this civil retinence. When you're coming towards someone on a bike path or walking trail in Seattle, you make steady eye contact, then smile and nod or say hello, just as you pass. And in the Seattle area, except downtown, we generally make eye contact when we pass someone while walking on the sidewalk. But things were quite different in Minneapolis, where I lived during my PhD. In Minneapolis, attempts to sustain eye contact communicate that you are hostile, creepy, or insane. If you want to sit alone on a crowded bus in Minneapolis, just attempt eye contact with everyone as they board the bus, and you can rest assured that you'll have the entire seat to yourself. It works especially well with current students who get on the bus at different stops than normal, drawing attention to their walk of shame situation. True story. Pretty awkward. Anyway, during interactions with family, friends, colleagues, and others with whom we're acquainted, eye contact, or lack thereof, can communicate quite a lot about the quality of the relationship. And eye contact communicates that we are paying attention to someone regardless of the relationship. But someone who avoids eye contact may be viewed as immature, disrespectful, submissive, or suspicious, as if they have something to hide. In sport, eye contact is incredibly important. Consider a simple basketball play such as a backdoor pass or a give and go. They are both incredibly simple plays, but timing is critical in each. Therefore, precise communication is key. Basketball players who've played together for a while usually learn to communicate precisely with their eyes without even realizing they're doing so. Before a backdoor pass, the post player will very subtly open up their eyes a little wider just as they are about to break for the basket. And a point guard will very subtly open their eyes a little wider just before making a pass to the post player and breaking toward the basket. If you've played organized basketball, you may have experienced the frustration of playing pickup basketball with people who don't speak your eye contact language. And this may be why, at least in my experience, you don't see a lot of backdoor passes, give and goes, or pick and roll plays that work particularly well in pickup basketball. Next, we communicate with touch, or haptic communication if you're not into the whole brevity thing. In everyday life, touch can play very different roles in our communication depending on the nature of the relationship. Touch can communicate comfort and safety. When a young child gets hurt or scared, they go immediately to their primary attachment figure, and they will not be consoled until they are picked up and soothed. In romantic relationship, touch obviously plays important roles in communicating affections, as alluded to in Extreme's 1990, More Than Words. It was before your time, but trust me, music gold. But even in more platonic relationships, touch can be important in affirming affection. In some cultures, it would be awkward to not hug a friend or family member upon greeting them or departing from them. And in many cultures, touch in the form of a handshake is an important way to greet and demonstrate goodwill when you're introduced to someone new. And even the way we shake hands provides information. A good, firm handshake sends a different message and jellyfish fingers. There are some ways of communicating affection through touch which are only considered appropriate in sport. Sometimes coaches will give their players a pat on the back to express appreciation, approval, encouragement, or support. But, no pun intended, sometimes the pat is a little lower. And for some reason, what would get you fired or incarcerated in an office setting is considered acceptable on a basketball court or a football field. But again, no pun intended, there are some rules articulated by Michael Strahan and Brett Favre, who both favor the palm method as opposed to the backhand method, which govern the practice. Don't cup, don't squeeze, don't look, and don't linger. Next, we have proxemic communication, or communication through space and distance. In our relationship, there are some rules at work. Speaking of work, if you're talking to a colleague, there is a certain distance that you need to keep to stay comfortable. If you get any closer, that person might dub you a close talker, a la Seinfeld. But with friends and family, you might be comfortable being a little closer within the confines of social space. But in intimate relationships, the rules are different, and expectations about keeping distance almost completely disappear, at least in private. In fact, research suggests that even when married couples are sleeping, distance says something about the quality of the relationship. And not surprisingly, close proximity while sleeping is associated with better marriages. But in sport, we make exceptions to the normal rules about social distance. Because, for example, you simply can't maintain social distance while guarding someone on the post in basketball, even if you haven't introduced yourself to that person already. And groups of people pile on top of each other in football, and they don't always keep their hands to themselves. And don't get me started on wrestling. So normal social rules about proximity are usually suspended throughout the duration of the athletic contest, at least while the ball's in play. But proximity in and of itself never seems to tell the whole story. Maintaining close proximity to a post player on defense to the extent that your bodies are completely pressed against each other is just part of basketball. But seeking that same proximity after a hard foul would send a different message to everyone in attendance, especially if the proximity was accompanied by an unfriendly facial expression. And just like drill sergeants, some coaches will defy the norms of social distance to make a point. Within seconds of a timeout in basketball, you see this happen rather frequently, with coaches seeking proximity to certain players to emphasize a point. Whether it be motivated by frustration or hostility, which fortunately only rarely co-occur with touch, or affection, which very often does. Communication is inextricably contextual, and proximity tends to amplify messages, whether they communicate hostility or intimacy. As I alluded to earlier, time is a context. The time between your girlfriend asking if you like her new wedges and your answer helps create a context in which the message is received. An unnervingly long delay before the answer might make her think that you're not being completely candid when you say, "They're perfect." But time can also be a message. Think about the order in which things occur at a traditional wedding ceremony. The guests sit down, the important family members are ushered in, then the bridesmaids enter. And who's the last person to arrive, besides your third cousin who smells of alcohol? The bride. And what does this communicate? That she's irresponsible? No, of course not. She comes in last because she is the star of the show. It's her day. It's also his day, but it's her day. Now in sport, the same thing happens at title bouts. The fans arrive before the fight to watch the bridesmaids duke it out on the undercard, and everything is set up before the challenger enters the ring. But it is only after the challenger has entered the ring that we see the defending champion emerge. And what does this communicate? It communicates that the defending champion is the star of the show. So being the last one to arrive can communicate importance, but it can also communicate incompetence. If a player shows up late for practice, it may communicate that the player thinks that he's the star of the show, or that the player thinks he's particularly important, but it doesn't always communicate that he is important. And if a coach shows up late for practice regularly, her players may not interpret her tardiness as a sign of her importance, but a sign of her incompetence or as evidence of her lack of care or commitment to the success of the team. Finally, we communicate through our appearance. I once played for a baseball coach who required us to shine our shoes on the bus ride to each game. His philosophy was, if you look good, you play good. Now, if we can pardon his grammar, he had a point. Our appearance communicates something to other people, but it also communicates something to us. So maybe there is something to the adage, dress for success. What we wear can actually influence our behavior. And there are several studies that have demonstrated that teams that wear black uniforms are more likely to play more aggressively and to commit more fouls. But when they're wearing their light-colored alternate uniforms, they play less aggressively and commit less fouls. Remember that our friends from Extreme were correct. Communication involves more than words. And it's not just facial expressions, eye contact, touch, time, and space. But becoming more aware of these forms of communication can be a good start. Because when words and nonverbal communication are inconsistent, people usually trust the nonverbal rather than the verbal. If you say, "Yes, I really do like those wedges," she'll get the message, despite your linguistic prevarication. Coach Giuliano was a master of communication, both verbal and nonverbal. And he seemed to be aware of how his messages, whether they be communicated with words, facial expressions, eye contact, or proximity, were received by those around him, his players, assistants, opponents, fans, and officials. This seemed to give him a tremendous advantage in influencing those around him. And those 3 rules I shared with you about communication, you can't not communicate, you can't take it back, and less is more, I learned from Dr. Giuliano, along with fancy words like haptics, chronemics, and proxemics, when he was my communications professor at Westmont College. They helped me become more aware of my communication as a tennis coach, and I hope that these ideas will help you become more aware of your communication, especially your nonverbal communication as well.